the units at Fukushima Daiichi were relatively early boiling water units, and the designs and the construction predated the lessons learned from 3 Mile Island. So yes, they were all plants, but I think also there's another thing to say, which is that in these very serious nuclear accidents, how harmful are they really? Yes, one can take hope that accidents like Fukushima Daiichi are less likely in the future, but I think even if one does take account of all the accidents that have happened, the number of deaths attributed to nuclear energy per kilowatt hour of electricity supplied is not as high as in some other sectors. My sense in looking at the Fukushima accident is that one can see it in broadly 2 ways. And of these 2 ways, I should say it's the first one that I'm going to describe that I tend to adopt, but I do respect the second view. So the way I see it is that it's interesting to look at the human story of these accidents, yes, rather than in the notional statistical people that people in nuclear policy can find themselves talking about, probabilistic things. No, I'm thinking in terms of the actual human stories of the people affected. And I'm very conscious that the so-called Fukushima 50, who were more than 50, they were rotating on shift work, but this relatively small community of people after the accident were extremely devoted to the task in hand, and frankly brave. And in a context where I imagine many of them at least were fearful about the status of their friends and relatives from the nearby region, when many of the nearby villages had been completely swept away. So this devotion to the task, I think, is completely admirable, and in fact, in some ways, it's part of a story whereby Fukushima was a nuclear accident on the back of a truly horrendous natural disaster. Unlike, for instance, 3 Mile Island, which was a lot of human error on the back of a relatively small technical issue, and Chernobyl, where, although it was a bad design, there was nothing wrong with that reactor on the day the ghost guys went to work and blew it up. Fukushima is not like that. So that's the way I tend to see it. But there's another way to see it, which is that this was a beyond design basis accident of the type that was never supposed to happen. And yet, with hindsight, and actually one would say before the hindsight, one should have known that the tsunami wall around the plant was grossly insufficient. And so how can an industry that makes such profound design basis errors be trusted? And I think that is a test that should be asked of the nuclear industry. How can it make such egregious errors, and how can we be sure it's not still making them? But my view is that fundamentally it's an accident on the back of a major natural disaster, and in which the responses of the individuals were frankly admirable. And there are risks around nuclear energy going forward, which aren't simply safety risks in the normal sense of the word. So they're security risks. So issues around nuclear proliferation, the relationship potentially between civil nuclear fuel cycles and the proliferation of nuclear weapons, and the broader nuclear security agenda on long timescales. Because the world has lived with an understanding of nuclear fission for 60 or 70 years, but are we going to be able to live with it for 500 years? And so those issues around security risks, I think, are a real concern, and a very difficult set of issues. So I think it's appropriate for the public to be vigilant and questioning about nuclear policy. I think that they're right to express concerns around safety, but of course different people with different awareness of the issues might highlight certain things more than others. But I'm not averse to public concern about nuclear energy. I think it's a very appropriate thing. It's clear that in many countries the management of spent fuel and the disposal of radioactive waste is a major cause of concern to the public. It's seen in the polling, and therefore technologists should respect that opinion from the public. My sense, however, is that it's easy to lose sight of other highly toxic wastes that exist in our industrialized societies. And I sometimes wonder if we, in our daily lives, because I'm one of the members of the public as well, if we tend to take the view that somehow 300,000 years is longer than infinity, right? If we take the view this radioactive waste is going to last for hundreds of thousands of years, that's more intimidating than saying it's going to last forever. Because highly toxic wastes are being disposed of all the time in, I would say, less carefully considered ways than nuclear wastes, and they will last forever. The other thing is that the public, when considering nuclear technology, every member of the society has many different roles to play in society, and it's funny when considering nuclear technologies that somehow I think the public think of themselves more of a kind of citizen than as a consumer. They see themselves potentially as the victims of a nuclear accident or the neighbours to a waste repository, rather than participants in a market buying and selling commodities, and I'm thinking here of buying electricity. I think a lot of the reaction to nuclear energy is seen through this lens of citizen of a community, and the intrusion that the waste facility might put on society or to their community, rather than a more holistic sense of what does this mean for my electricity bill in the future energy mix. But I use the phrase with reference to an increase in the rate of construction of new nuclear power stations, but particularly in Europe and North America. Because frankly the phrase has no meaning for Asia. There was no dramatic decline in activity in Asia, but most definitely was in Europe and North America. So the phrase is used with reference to the possibility that there'll be effectively a second wave of nuclear power plant construction in Europe and North America. I think some level of nuclear renaissance in Europe and North America is probable. But I think it is quite possible it will not exceed replacing nuclear with nuclear, which means that it makes no progress at all on things like greenhouse gas emissions reduction. It makes very little difference to the security of electricity supplies, and frankly is not contributing much to the solution. I think the idea that there will never be another nuclear power plant constructed in Europe or North America is very unlikely. We have strong projects moving forward here in the UK, and you can see examples elsewhere in Europe and North America. But the phrase nuclear renaissance can imply things stronger than that. It can imply that there's a wave of construction that matches the most energetic efforts of the past or even exceeds them. And that I think is far from inevitable. I think it's unclear what the future will be, but I think definitely nuclear power is an option that deserves to be considered on its merit. But it's not manifest or obvious that nuclear power should have a strong role in the future. That's not my view. Well, you look at the numbers and the policy statements, and it's clear that there's a major expansion underway in both China and India. I don't know the China situation directly, but I have some awareness of the India situation, and the plans and the capabilities are impressive. I said in regard to the United Kingdom that I see that energy policy will always be political, and will never be a day when it's simply economics and the market. But I think that statement is true much more generally. I think that the factors shaping global energy policy are similarly not just issues of economics. They're complex issues which vary from culture to culture, history to history. But I look to countries like China and India and also Russia, and I see strong progress forward in nuclear energy. Well, my view is that society benefits from having options, and that's important in the context of nuclear renaissance. I'm not saying we need to deploy advanced nuclear technologies in the 2030s and 2040s, but I think right now advanced economies would be wise to put in place research and development programs so that in the future those making the decisions have the choice. They will, I hope, be doing that in a democratic framework. So I think that to deny these options constrains the sort of future democratic choices of citizens in the future. So I think that there's a drive there for increased nuclear research in order to provide options. But I don't presume to say that those involved in developing nuclear technology need to deliver their solutions right now on an unwilling public and to an unwilling energy industry. No, not at all. I think what you have right now in the UK is the energy industry is investing in established nuclear technologies, and there will be underway a renaissance at some level, perhaps a modest level, but that doesn't avoid the need for the underlying research continuing. Clearly renewables have a role to play, and it's clear that today fossil fuels have a role to play. And I see nuclear sitting alongside those things. I also see benefit in diversity. I think that to have a wholly nuclear electricity system would, for instance, be a move away from goodness in energy security terms. So I'm very focused on the idea to provide options for the future. As to my guess as to what the future will hold, well, I think it's easy to confuse the way the future, the way the world could be from the way the world should be and the way the world will be. I think that it's clear what we might think the way the world should be, which is this low carbon scenario. And the way the world could be is interesting. Can we generate that low carbon future? But the way the world will be, I don't know. I think I'm not necessarily optimistic. Nuclear energy policy is very much part of energy policy. And I subscribe to the view that energy policy is driven by three factors. Economics, security of supply, and the environment. And I work a lot with economists, and some, but not all of them, I think, look forward to a happy day in the future when there's a price for carbon and a value for lost load, and then the environment and security aspects will be part of economics, and this will be a market-led industry. I fundamentally don't think that day will ever come. I think these three aspects of security, environment, and market will always be in tension with each other. And at different times, different ones are ascendant. Right? But these are the three main issues that nuclear energy has to be considered against, I would suggest. And for a country like the United Kingdom, broadly, it looks attractive right now in terms of energy security. It looks attractive in terms of environment, interpreted through the lens of climate change. But economics is difficult. Well, for a country like the United Kingdom, let's consider energy security. The United Kingdom has no uranium mines. But uranium fuel for nuclear power stations is very benign and physically very compact and so easily stored. So that in energy policy terms in this country, it's interpreted as a domestic resource. One can easily store enough for national needs. And it comes from very stable parts of the world compared to, say, the fossil fuels. And those are very diverse parts of the world. They're not concentrating in ever smaller geographical regions, as is happening with fossil fuels. So that's what leads me to suggest that the energy security benefits of nuclear power look pretty good. The environmental attribute, as I say, is fundamentally stated through consideration of CO2 emissions. And while there is some debate about the precise amount of CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour of electricity generated, I think it is clear that this is indeed a low carbon source of electricity. Anyone who's ever visited a nuclear power plant and a coal-fired power plant can see that very readily. You see the tons of pulverized coal going into a coal-fired power plant. So it's through the lens of CO2. But the economics is the really interesting thing, I think. Because the United Kingdom, for instance, has a so-called liberalised market in electricity. That means that the generating companies are in competition with each other, and the government most definitely does not build power stations. So the proposition for the investors, the companies, let's say, is an interesting one, because they have the power of initiative. They choose what to build, and they're the ones making the investment decisions. And right now, renewables are special because they're subsidised, but there's a choice between, let's say, natural gas and nuclear. And the investors building a natural gas-fired power station, they can be up and running relatively quickly. Sort of the risk in the business model is the future price of natural gas. But in this country, I think they could take comfort from the fact that the day the gas price went up, the electricity price would go up as well. So that risk would be passed through to consumers. The nuclear power plant investment decision is much more daunting. The scale of investment is extremely large, around £5 billion, and it's all money up front. roughly 2/3 of the lifetime levelized cost of electricity from nuclear is the capital cost, whereas something like 3/4 of the lifetime levelized cost of electricity in the gas proposition is the fuel cost. So the decision to invest £5 billion in a nuclear power plant can be a daunting one. And my view is that when you're 6 months from opening day, you definitely don't yet have an asset. There are things that can go wrong with the project and the idea, and if it does happen before selling electricity, then the investors are in a very difficult position. I think that there's a three-way choice for investors, and as I said, in my country, investors have a strong voice in these decisions. And so I see that three-way choice as being a choice between renewables, which is incentivized by public support and financial intervention. A choice with fossil fuels, which would be gas, and of course the nuclear investment choice. And the things that will drive that relative decision, I think, are issues around the future price of gas, which is itself full of uncertainty with the transition from pipeline gas to liquefied natural gas and the global impacts of shale gas, the possibility of local shale gas production. There's a lot of uncertainty around natural gas. So natural gas and its numbers represents one important consideration. The other one is the future of the greenhouse gas emissions agenda, and perhaps made real through the imposition of a price on carbon. Now, of course, in Europe we have a emission traded scheme and a price for carbon, but as you probably know, it's had a difficult history. The price has crashed, and right now the price is very low. But looking on the bright side, we do have in Europe a traded carbon scheme. So I think uncertainties around the future price of gas and the future price of carbon are going to affect the choice on whether to invest in nuclear. There's been learning in the renewables sector, and costs are coming down. One sees it particularly strongly in solar technologies. So I would say that broadly, wind energy, for instance, but perhaps other renewables and nuclear are broadly cost competitive with each other, and they're both too expensive. They are significantly more expensive than fossil fuel options, and that's where the carbon price comes in. It's important to point to the fact that in our modern societies we use a lot of energy and we waste a lot of energy. It is clear that we could do so much more with so much less. So I think that the most important energy option is to be more sparing in the use of limited resources. And even renewables have limited resources because there are only so many windy places in the United Kingdom, etc. So I think that that's the most important thing, to make better use of what we have. I'm William Nuttall. I'm a senior lecturer in technology policy at Judge Business School in the University of Cambridge.